Well, good to see all of you again. Here we are at the very end of the semester, and that means this is the final lecture. It will cover Reconstruction following the war between the states. As I've previously stated, this lecture will not be part of your final exam. So just like our in-person class, you were going to come in, take your test on that last night, and then you were mandated to stay for a final lecture over which you would never be tested. We're doing the same thing here. So you've already received your test questions and the deadlines and all that kind of stuff, but we still have an evening to go and a chance to talk about Reconstruction, and we are going to do that. So this is a mandatory lecture. I'm going to be sprinkling some questions throughout the lecture. So unlike previous lectures where all the questions are kind of grouped at the end, this time I'm going to sprinkle them throughout to ensure that you're listening and you're getting all of this information. You'll need to send those in to me very quickly by the 15th of May. In order for me to be able to verify that you listened to this last lecture and go ahead and complete your grade. Okay, so let's jump into it. If you're following along in the book, this is chapter 16. So the war is over, but this war, remember, had been waged to keep the southern slave states in the Union and to overturn the doctrine of secession. And Union military success, of course, has managed to do that. But now you have the conundrum of how do you put together a country that the North had argued throughout the entire war had never actually come apart. The North always insisted that there was no Southern Confederacy, that secession was illegal and unconstitutional and had in fact therefore not occurred, that the states were still in the Union. In fact, those stars that represented the seceded states on the U.S. flag had been removed during the war. There had been some that were added. West Virginia became a state in 1863, Colorado a state in 1864, Kansas became a state in 1861. So stars have been added, but no stars had been taken away. And now the North has to grapple with the really hard thing. Winning the war was complicated and difficult enough, but now the question of how do you make the peace worth the victory? How do you make the peace worth the price that had been paid? How do you make the peace something that is... How do you make the peace something that is going to really hold the Union together and make the Union meaningful going forward? And there were 6 basic questions that had to be addressed in dealing with the question of Reconstruction. And one of those is, what do you do with the seceded states? What's their status? This is kind of embarrassing to the North. Like I said, they'd always maintained these states had left the Union, legally speaking, although they had in fact left the Union and had in fact been a separate country. But if you're arguing that these states had never left the Union, then what justification do you have to go in and monkey with these states, to mess with their forms of government or their political or economic or labor structures, that kind of thing? It sort of seems to argue that there's no justification for Reconstruction. There were some of the radical Republicans who floated around the idea that by seceding, states had committed, in essence, political suicide and had reverted back to territorial status, which of course gives Congress control over that land. But that idea never really seemed to catch on. This is a question that the North is basically going to ignore. Reconstruction is going to be a sort of fly by the seat of your pants kind of an endeavor. Issues will be dealt with as they came up, and therefore this question of were the states in, were they out of the Union, really becomes very, very theoretical, though it's interesting from a jurisprudence standpoint. The next question, what do you do with the rebels? What do you do with the men who had rebelled against the United States government? from the privates on up through the generals and the heads of government. Do you punish them in some way? Do you punish all of them? Do you just punish their leaders, which was sort of where the impetus goes? There were simply too many common soldiers and common sailors and common government employees. You would be wiping out a good chunk of Southern society if you executed all those people or you threw them in jail. So the emphasis here is, what do you do with the rebel leaders? Do you put them in jail? Do you exile them? Do you take away their citizenship, take away their political rights, their ability to hold political power? Do you seize their land and their property? There was a real worry amongst Northerners that the South would somehow regain political power. And that the men who had dominated the national government from the southern wing of the Democratic Party before the war breaks out, had led the Confederacy during the war, would somehow find themselves back in control of the national government and therefore deny the North the real fruits of its victory. Third question, what do you do with the freed slaves? What do you do with the slaves who are in states that didn't leave the Union and therefore are untouched by the Emancipation Proclamation? How do you guarantee that the freedmen, as they are now called, are going to have real rights? Does that mean that you're going to have to militarily occupy the South to guarantee that? Are you going to somehow give these freedmen the ability to protect themselves? Are you going to give them the vote? Are you going to give them education? Are you going to confiscate land from former rebels and hand that over to them so that they can have a livelihood? That question was going to have to be grappled with. And then another theoretical question, this one kind of being pushed by the radical Republicans and the abolitionists. Should we remake Southern society? To what extent can we remake Southern society? Go in and basically rip the South's culture out by the roots and try and plant a Northern culture that was perceived, at least by Northerners, to be more modern in its place. And certainly if you could get rid of the Southern power base, the Southern economic base, the Southern political leadership, then there would be less of a threat to the Union going forward. And now a really fundamental question, and in many ways this is the one that is going to absorb most of the energy. And that question is, who gets to run the show? Who gets to be in charge of Reconstruction? Reconstruction is something that the Founding Fathers had never envisioned. They never imagined that there would be a civil war and that the country would have to be put back together in the aftermath of an incredibly brutal and bloody civil war. So they said nothing about the process of Reconstruction, who would be in charge of it, who would run it, what the rules would be in the Constitution. There was no precedent for something like this, not in the American experience and not really in the experience of any other country around the world at that point. So you have, a question to which in some way there is no answer. And what there was in the Constitution to go by sort of pointed in different directions. Some you could argue, would argue that the president should be in charge of Reconstruction. The president has the power to pardon. Pardoning former rebels and what some Northerners call traitors would certainly be something necessary. That the president has his war powers, which are vague but extensive. And after all, this is at the end of a big war. The president is always there. He's always there. Unlike Congress, he doesn't go into recess. He's always in office, always ready to act and decide. And beyond that, of course, it is the executive branch of the government, the presidency, that administers policies, rules, regulations, administers laws, enacts the policies that are put into place by the administration and by the legislative branch of government. It is the presidency that administers and enacts the rulings of the Supreme Court and the federal court. So there's an argument that the president should be in charge. Then there's the argument that Congress should be in charge. After all, Congress declares war and Congress makes peace, that you're going to have to pass laws and you're going to have to spend money, and only Congress can pass laws and only Congress can appropriate money. Congress has veto power over its own membership. So Congress is the judge of its own members, and therefore it would be up to Congress whether it would receive and accept congressmen and senators from the seceded states. The administration could not force Congress to do that. And then finally, you have a sort of, logistical question. When does Reconstruction actually happen? How fast should it go? How quickly should it be accomplished? Could there even be timetables in regards to this? And so you had two kind of fundamental philosophical poles here in the argument over Reconstruction. And one of that is the radical Republican abolitionist point of view that there should be a cultural, economic, political revolution in the South. The South should be turned into the North. Land should be taken away from former rebels. They should be barred from ever holding office or having any political rights whatsoever. The freedmen should be enfranchised and given land and lifted up. And then you had the moderate Republicans and the Democrats who said, no, what we're trying to do here is simply restore the Union. This is what the war had been primarily fought for. Remember that destroying slavery had become a means to the end of saving the Union. And what we've always been after is to put the country back together. And if you attempt revolution, you will engender more hatred, more bitterness. You run the risk of actually restarting the war. That's not what we were after. The Northern people have accomplished their primary goal, which was to save the Union, and in the eyes of many Northerners, they therefore saved the very concept of democratic government. And they had broken the power of the Southern political class, both economically and politically, and they had destroyed slavery as a means of doing that, and therefore they felt that they had removed the great threat to the Union, the thing that had threatened the Union before the war, the thing that had broke the Union up and caused the war, and the thing against which the North had waged war. Having accomplished those things, how much further did Northerners want to go? How much more did they want to spend? How much more effort and time and money, let alone possibly lives, that they wish to invest? And what we're going to see is that as time goes by, the Northern energy in this question is going to wane. And every time something gets done, there'll be more of an incentive to say, well, we've done enough. It's also important to remember that although Northerners were sympathetic to the freedmen, that sympathy went so far. The North, remember, was as racist as the South. Segregation, which is going to become more prominent in the South in the wake of the Civil War, is actually a system that was invented in the North, not the South. In the South, you actually had a biracial society. Blacks and whites lived, worked, loved, played, died side by side. It was not an equal society, but it was certainly biracial, whereas in the North, where there were far fewer blacks, they were often segregated. They had no political rights. And remember, there are states like Illinois, which in the 1850s had passed a law barring a free person of color from living within the boundaries of the state. And Illinois was not unique in this regard. So Northerners are willing to go so far to assist the freedmen, but they're only willing to go so far. The North is, in terms of racial attitudes, right there with the South. By modern standards, of course, blatantly racist. But this concept of white supremacy was as much a Northern thing as it was a Southern thing, and therefore there's not a great zeal to do a whole bunch for a long time to help out the freedmen. So we're going into a process here where there are no rules, where there's no clear authority that gets to be in charge of things, and naturally the politics plays into this. So one of the great ironies here is that the Republican Party, which had come to power to resist Southern politics and the expansion of slavery into the territories and then to save the Union, the Republican Party has accomplished its mission with the end of the Civil War, hasn't it? It has not only contained slavery, it has destroyed slavery. Remember, in the waning months of the conflict, the 13th Amendment had gotten through Congress, and it would go on to be ratified by the necessary number of states. And the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery throughout the entire country, not just in the states that it seceded, not just behind Confederate lines like Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had done. It abolished it everywhere, including in the slave states that had stayed loyal to the Union. So slavery is done. Southern political and economic power is broken. Expansion of slavery, a moot issue. Restoring the Missouri Compromise, therefore a moot issue. The Union saved. Why does the Republican Party exist now? Where does the Republican Party go from this point forward? Remember that the Republicans have only existed since 1854. They're a relatively new party, and parties came and went in the 19th century. After all, we've seen Democratic Republicans, National Republicans, we've seen Whigs, we've seen Liberty Party. Parties come, they hang around for an election or two, then they're gone. There's no guarantee that the Republican Party is going to live past this. And then, of course, there is the great irony that with the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery, you have also rendered moot the 3/5 compromise that said slaves only count as 3/5 of a white person for the purposes of determining representation in the Congress. And ironically, what that means is that slaves, who are now freedmen, count as a whole person. And thus, the South actually is going to get more congressmen after the Civil War than it had before the Civil War. And of course, that will strengthen the power of the Democratic Party, and conversely, it will dilute the relative power of the Republican Party. These are some of the background issues, some of the ironies that we're looking at here. But Reconstruction did not wait for the war to be over. It was something that had begun fairly early on because it was going to be necessary. Lincoln had started the process in December of 1863 by putting forward what he called his 10% plan. This is actually the first of many plans. We're basically going to get one a year between 1863 and 1867 as sort of a way of indicating how unsettled this process is. What Lincoln was trying to do was to get states back into the Union even as the war was going on. And in doing so, and proving that the North was willing to accept Southerners back into the Union with rights and privileges as they had been before, he was kind of hoping to divide Southerners against themselves, to divide the Confederates. That didn't really happen. But he does put down the first marker for Reconstruction, and what Lincoln proposes is known famously as his 10% plan, the 10% plan. And basically, this is rooted in his power to pardon. He will pardon for treason or rebellion anyone who comes in and takes an oath of office or an oath of allegiance to the United States, unless you had been an office holder in the Confederate government or a ranking officer in the Confederate military, a colonel above in the Army, a lieutenant or above in the Navy. Everybody else was eligible to come in and take that oath. And if they took that oath, they would be able to vote. The one caveat here, of course, is that they had to have been an eligible voter before 1860, and ironically that means that most blacks would be ineligible to vote because they had been slaves before 1860. So this is really an offer to white Southerners, and it sort of leaves ambiguous what happens to all those Confederate governmental officials and those high-ranking officers in the Confederate military. That'll be figured out later. But if you took the oath of allegiance, you received a pardon, you had to accept the rightness and legality of the Emancipation Proclamation, but if any of your property had been confiscated by the Union military, it would now be restored, except, of course, property and slaves. And once 10% of the people, of the registered voters in any state that came in and took that oath, they could hold a election to organize a state government. that government would be recognized by Washington, D.C., and that state would be considered restored to the Union. It could send congressmen and senators, it would have its electoral votes again, and all of the rights and privileges of a state in the North, or a state that a state had before the outbreak of the Civil War. And in terms of trying to make this all more palatable to Southerners, Lincoln said that he was open to ideas about temporary arrangements concerning the landless, the homeless, and ex-laborers, i.e. freed slaves. Lincoln wasn't necessarily saying, hey, we have to jump right from slavery for these people to full citizenship, the full franchise, that kind of thing. He recognized some of the practical realities of the situation. These people had no jobs, they had no money, they had no education. Where would they live? How would they make a living? And maybe there was some middle ground, some transition periods, some transitional arrangements that had to be made to make all of this work out practically. So Lincoln issues his 10% plan. It has some success. It goes into effect in states where the Union armies have managed to conquer fair amounts of territory. So it happens in Louisiana, it happens in Tennessee, it's tried in Arkansas, it's attempted in Florida. It has some success, but not a lot. The radical Republicans in 1864 put forward a very different plan, and that plan Lincoln ignores. It's called the Wade-Davis Bill, and it was passed by the Congress in December toward the very end of their session. Under the Constitution, the president has to sign or veto a bill, but if legislation is passed at the end of the session and Congress then goes out of session, the president can simply pocket veto it. Since Congress's session is over, the president doesn't have to sign or veto, and therefore he could ignore it, and that's what Lincoln did. But it does mean that in 1865, we have opposition to Lincoln's 10% plan. The radical Republicans and the abolitionists want a harsh Reconstruction. They want to punish the South for rebellion and treason. They want to do the maximum to uphold the rights and to make a better life for the freedmen. At the same time, of course, they want to ensure the continued existence and superiority of the Republican Party in Congress. And as a result, we've got a dichotomy here. There's certainly not agreement between Lincoln and the Congress. And of course, Lincoln is reelected in November of 1864. He's inaugurated in March of 1865 for his second term. He gives his famous second inaugural address, one of his more famous speeches, in which he talks about, with malice toward none, with charity for all, let's take care of the widows, the orphans, let's bind the wounds, let's put the country back together. Lincoln muses in that address that the war is God's punishment. The war is God's punishment on the United States for the sin of slavery. And he says that perhaps it is God's will that every drop of blood that had been drawn by the lash of the slaveholder must now be repaid by a drop of blood drawn by the sword. But Lincoln muses that both North and South are guilty of this sin, and therefore they are being punished equally. This is not a view that radical Republicans were deposed to accept. And what would have happened if Lincoln had not been assassinated in the middle of April of 1865? How this struggle would have come out, we don't know. But Lincoln was assassinated. Lincoln is murdered by John Wilkes Booth, and that means that the vice president, for only the third time in American history, has to step up and take over the reins of the executive branch. This is the first time that happens because of assassination. It's the first time it happens to a president who wasn't a Whig. We do start a precedent here, though, with Lincoln, who's elected, remember, in November of 1860, that every president who is elected or reelected in a year ending with 0 does not live through his term of office. And that is going to be the case all the way up until Ronald Reagan, who is elected in 1980, and 6 months in, it's not like somebody didn't try and keep that unfortunate trend going. John Hinckley tried to assassinate Reagan. He shot him and very badly hurt him. Thanks to modern medicine, Reagan survived, and that trend was broken. But here we go, the third time vice president becoming president of the United States. And there's great irony in this because the new president, Andrew Johnson, is a Democrat from a seceded state, the state of Tennessee. Johnson came from eastern Tennessee. That was where his constituency was before the war. He had always sort of stood up to the mainstream power in the South, which was dominated by the planter class. Johnston was born into a poor family. His father was a tailor, so he hated the planters and he hated the plantations. He had no love for slavery, although he certainly was not an abolitionist by any means. He had no particular love for blacks either. When the southern states seceded, he was the only U.S. senator or congressman who refused to resign his office and follow the Confederacy. And of course, that made him something of a celebrity in the North. It was very useful to Lincoln, who wanted to point and say, look, this isn't Republican versus Democrat. These are loyal people and rebellious people. But with Tennessee in the Confederacy, well, there was nobody really for Johnson to represent. So he was out of the Senate, but as soon as the North conquered enough of Tennessee to justify it, it created a military or a wartime government, and the 10% plan goes into effect, and Lincoln appoints Andrew Johnson to be the wartime governor of Tennessee. In this capacity, he did a fairly decent job. Then in 1864, Lincoln is running for re-election, and he knows that the odds are really against him. Remember, this is a very, very bad time in the war for the North. The battles are becoming more frequent. They are becoming increasingly bloody. The casualties are piling up, and Sherman is stalemated outside of Atlanta. The federal Red River campaign to get into Texas blows up in the Union's face. Grant is stalemated outside of Richmond and Petersburg. Lincoln believes that he's going to lose the election, but he pulls out all the stops in order to win. And one of the things the Republicans do is to make a pitch for pro-war Northern Democrats. In other words, there were lots of Northern Democrats who believed in saving the Union. They had no love for the Republican Party, but they wanted to save the Union. And with the nomination of George McClellan, who was running on patently a peace platform that would probably not save the Union, Lincoln saw the utility in having a Democratic running mate. And so he gave the nod to Andrew Johnson. Didn't want to pick a Northern Democrat because he would be more likely to be a rival, but this was a symbolic pick, as all vice presidential picks were in that era, and in many ways even into the modern day, and nobody had thought much of it. Lincoln won the election because Union military victories made it look like the war was not a failure. And what that meant was that Andrew Johnson had become vice president, and then thanks to John Wilkes Booth, he becomes president. And nobody and I quite knew what that meant, what was going to happen, but it means Johnson inherits the sticky business of Reconstruction. And as a result, he gets to be in charge because Congress is out of session. And Congress is not going to come back into session until December of 1865, and so from April to December, Johnson is in charge. And at first, he speaks very harshly about punishing rebels and doing all these sorts of things. That sounds really good to the ears of the radical Republicans, but in fact, what Johnson does is he pursues the 10% plan. He pursues the 10% plan so that by the time that the Congress comes back into session, you've had 10% of the eligible voters in 1860 in virtually every state who have come up. They've taken the oath of office. They've been pardoned. They've elected people to the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. And of course, most of these people were former Confederates. You had Confederate generals, Confederate congressmen, Confederate senators, even the vice president of the Confederacy were elected to go represent the southern states in the post-war Congress. And in many ways, this makes sense. A lot of these people had certainly made or burnished their reputations working for the South during the Civil War. These are the people that the South was used to leading them, used to voting for. But this was a real shock to the North because it's just won the war, just won this huge contest, and the first Congress that sits in the aftermath of that war, there are all these former rebels, some of them still wearing their Confederate uniforms because those were the only decent clothes that they had. And of course, a lot of them were pre-war politicians, and so they knew the pre-war politicians from the North that came over, shake hands, hey, how you been? I haven't seen you for 4 years. What have you been doing? Well, I was in the Army. I was fighting your rebellion. Oh, well, that's cool. I'm so glad that we can work together again. In other words, the South had lost, but it wasn't acting like a loser. And that was terrifying to a lot of Northerners who had feared that, especially with the end of the Three-Fifths Compromise, the South was just going to try and pick up where it left off. It would dominate the Democratic Party, which is still the majority party, and therefore it would come to dominate the government, and it would be as if nothing really had changed. And so the South is flummoxing the North, and the North and the radical Republicans are not very happy with Johnston. In addition to that, in the southern states, they're passing black codes. They are called black codes, and these were reminiscent of the old slave codes, said what free blacks, former slaves, could do, the curfews and passes and these sorts of things. In other words, the South might not have slavery, but it's still intended to control the former slave population. And this was another thing that made Northerners very, very unhappy. So in response, the Republicans in Congress created a joint committee on Reconstruction. It was going to be their way to have a voice. Interestingly, the committee is really made up of moderates. The idea here is that they are going to give President Johnson information so he can make better decisions. And in order to sort of keep things going, the Congress passed two pieces of legislation. One of them was a bill to extend the life of something called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau had been created in March of 1865 as the war was winding down. It was the full title was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It was part of the War Department. It was really the first welfare agency in U.S. history. It was designed to help Southerners in the transition from war to peace, from the transition from chaos to order, from slavery to freedom. It was going to provide food and clothing and medical care, which people could not get in a destroyed economy. And these were things that the War Department, of course, was able to do. And it had been passed with 1 year life, and then it would have to be renewed. And Congress looks around and says, well, this work is really just beginning, so we want to renew this. And they passed a bill to do so. And then they passed another piece of legislation, a civil rights bill, which was designed to protect freedmen, the rights of freedmen. It says that all blacks are citizens, and it provided for the transfer of legal proceedings from state to federal courts if southern states were discriminating on the basis of race. And Andrew Johnson vetoed both these pieces of legislation. Andrew Johnson was a strict constitutionalist, sort of in the extreme. He argued that renewing the Freedmen's Bureau was premature because it still had a month to go before it would expire. He said it was unnecessary, that it was unconstitutional because it gave the military power in peacetime, and that it dealt with people who were not represented in Congress, that is, former slaves and unreconstructed Confederates, and therefore it was unconstitutional. He made the same kind of arguments against the Civil Rights Bill, and added to them the fact that the Congress had no power to deal with issues like discrimination, that in fact the bill discriminated against immigrants because it didn't automatically make them citizens. And as far as Congress was concerned, all of this was pretty spurious. It wasn't logical. It didn't make sense. It was really Johnson saying Congress should have no role in Reconstruction, that he would be calling the shots. And of course, Congress did not agree with that. And so what Congress did in response to Johnson's veto is something that no Congress had ever managed to do in American history before. It overrode the vetoes. Congress can override presidential vetoes by a 2/3 majority vote in both the House and the Senate. That had never happened. And it happens to Johnson for the first time. And both his veto of the Freedmen's Bureau bill and the Civil Rights bill are overturned. And this was a great asserting of power by Congress, and especially the radical Republicans in Congress, a weakening of the presidency. And having overrode these bills, Congress now puts forward its own plan for Reconstruction, and it puts this plan forward in the form of a constitutional amendment. This would be the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which is really the radical Republicans' plan to reconstruct the South. And this 14th Amendment says a lot of things. First off, that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States. So if you're born in the U.S., regardless of color, you're a citizen. So former slaves are all citizens. And as citizens, of course, you get all the protections of the Bill of Rights and that sort of stuff. And therefore, no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny any person equal protection of the law. It's this phrase that makes the 14th Amendment one of the most utilized amendments in American history. You hear about the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause all the time. So the Congress through this amendment is basically saying former slaves are citizens. They have all the rights of citizens. You can't mistreat them. If you're going to take away their liberty, you got to throw them in jail. You're going to seize property, just like with anybody else. You have to charge them with a crime. There has to be trial, there has to be conviction, and that sort of stuff. Everybody is to be treated equally under the law. So those are sort of big principles that are being put down. And then the 14th Amendment sort of goes into some Reconstruction specifics. So we have this awkward business about the 3/5 compromise going away, and therefore the South having more congressional seats. All right. The one thing that the Republicans want to ensure happens is that blacks are allowed to vote, and of course black men are allowed to vote. And naturally, they are going to vote for the Republicans because the Republicans are the party of Lincoln. They're the party of emancipation, and that would dilute a lot of that extra congressional power that the South is going to get by the end of the 3/5 compromise. Now, the North suspected the South was going to try and find ways to keep those black voters from exercising the franchise, that is, going to the polls, and the North seemed to understand that it probably really couldn't prevent that from happening, but what it could do is it could use it to political advantage. So the 14th Amendment goes on to say that any state that denies an adult black male citizen the right to vote will have its representation in Congress decreased accordingly. So the North is basically saying you have to let blacks vote. They'll vote Republican to the benefit of the Republican Party in the North. If you deny blacks the right to vote, the way we're going to punish you is we're going to deduct those population totals from the census, basically. And that will shrink the number of congressional seats you get. It will be, in fact, worse than the 3/5 compromise, because if basically you're going to deny all the blacks the right to vote, you're going to lose all of the black count in the census, and you're going to have fewer congressmen, which will, of course, weaken the power of the Democrats and conversely increase the power, relatively speaking, of the Republicans. The third thing that the the 14th Amendment does is it says that anybody who, it punishes traitors and rebels, or is what Northerners saw as traitors and rebels. It says that if you had taken an oath to the United States and then gone on to join the Confederacy, you were barred from holding office in state or federal government. So if you had been in the U.S. Army, if you had worked for the federal government, you had been a congressman, you've been a senator, you've been an ambassador, that kind of thing, and then you went and supported the Confederacy, you are now barred from holding office, the state or federal government. Now, Congress could cancel that at any time. Congress is basically saying that it would have the power to pardon. But there was no limitation on this, on how long the disbarment would last. It could be forever, so there's no time limit here. And then the 14th Amendment does a couple other things. It says the U.S. debt shall be paid in full. The debt of the Confederacy is illegal and therefore null and void. And it gives Congress the power to enforce the 14th Amendment with appropriate legislation. So this is a big deal. The 14th Amendment basically throws out the old Dred Scott decision that says blacks aren't citizens, can't be citizens, and therefore they have no rights. That's gone with the 14th Amendment. But it's interesting that this is really not terribly radical, especially in light of what some of the abolitionists and radical Republicans wanted to do. It doesn't disenfranchise most Southerners. Nobody's going to be tried for treason. Nobody's going to be exiled. Nobody's going to be thrown in jail. There's going to be no confiscation of land, any of these sorts of things. But Johnson hated this, and he urged the old Confederate states to reject it. And of course, if these 10% planned governments refused to ratify it, you could not get to the necessary number of states to put this into the Constitution. And all of the former rebel states, except Johnson's own Tennessee, followed his advice. Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment and was immediately readmitted into the Union. And for Tennessee, Reconstruction is over. But the rest of the southern states refused to go along. And so that sets up the ongoing argument here, and it creates a crisis for the Congress's relationship with Johnson. So we have a situation now to where things are kind of getting really messy. The fight between Johnson and the Congress is going to become more intense, and it's going to lead to Johnson basically getting impeached. So what's going to happen here is that in 1867, after a series of race riots in southern cities in which a lot of blacks were killed, as Southerners sort of, vented about being defeated, occupation, and these sorts of things, the Congress came up with another Reconstruction Act that disbanded the 10% governments, declared martial law in the defeated Confederate states with the exception of Tennessee. There were still 10 of those states. They're now divided into 5 military districts, and the Army is going to occupy these. The Army is to enroll all voters, to enfranchise blacks. It's to disenfranchise former rebels who are mentioned in the 14th Amendment. So, colonels and above in the Army, lieutenants and above in the Navy, people who had taken an oath of allegiance to the U.S. but had gone to the Confederacy, and those enrolled voters are to hold a convention to write a new state constitution. That constitution must provide for black suffrage. Then there could be elections for state officers and Congress. The new state legislature would be required to ratify the 14th Amendment, which of course makes the ratification of the 14th Amendment somewhat controversial because it's being done under duress. But once the 14th Amendment was ratified, then the state's congressmen and senators would be seated, and you would have an end to military rule, an end to martial law, but not not military occupation. Johnson, of course, vetoed this Reconstruction Act of 1867. Congress overrode the veto, and so once again we have Congress and the president battling. But notice that, like the 14th Amendment, this Reconstruction Act of 1867 is mainly a political instrument, isn't it? There's still no executions, no arrests, no exiles, no confiscation of land. There's no money being appropriated to organize or fund black schools or any of this kind of stuff. It's sort of a consensus opinion amongst Northerners. In fact, only 6 northern states allowed black suffrage, and 3 of those 6 refused to go along with this act. And so the North is sort of resistant to some of this as well. This is going to lead to the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment gets ratified in 1868, and the next year you get the 15th Amendment that gives the vote to all blacks, black males everywhere. As a consequence of that, the Congress has basically taken charge. But by putting the military in control of the South, the Congress has sort of outwitted itself because the president's the commander-in-chief. And the president can tell the military to go easy on the South. There can be a soft Reconstruction, and as a consequence of that, Johnson suddenly has more power over the Reconstruction process. The only thing that could limit that power was the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who had been Lincoln's Secretary of War. And as Lincoln's Secretary of War, he had been very effective, but he's part of the Radical Republicans, and so he intends, as Secretary of War, to appoint officers to commands and to issue orders that will make for a harsh Reconstruction. Johnson, as Commander-in-Chief, wants exactly the opposite. Since the Secretary of War works at the pleasure of the president, it was clear that Johnson was going to fire him. And if Johnson fires him and replaces somebody who is more compliant, replaces him with somebody who's more compliant, then Congress will have short-circuited its own plan. And to prevent Johnson from firing him, the Congress rapidly passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, which says that in the same way that the Senate has to confirm a presidential nomination to a cabinet position, the Senate also has to confirm the president's decision to fire a cabinet officer. Now, this is blatantly illogical and unconstitutional, but of course it's going to take time for the Supreme Court to say, hey, that's unconstitutional. Until the Supreme Court does, the law is the law. Johnson, of course, vetoed it. Congress overrode the veto, and so Congress thinks that it's got Stanton in office for good. And Johnson says, oh no, I don't think this law is constitutional at all, and he fired Stanton. Stanton refused to be fired. He barricaded himself in his office, had food smuggled in. Johnson simply appointed another guy, George Lorenzo Thomas, to be Secretary of War, and he moved into an office down the hallway and went to running the War Department. But Congress saw in the president's blatant disobedience to the Tenure of Office Act an excuse to get rid of Johnson, and it immediately voted to impeach him. The House of Representatives voted to impeach. And remember, impeach is constitutional language for indictment. It doesn't mean to remove from office. It means to charge with a crime. And the way it's supposed to work is there's supposed to be investigations, and then you're supposed to draft articles of impeachment, and then there's supposed to be debate, and those articles are supposed to be debated on. The Radical Republican Congress did this in exactly the opposite way. They voted to impeach Johnson, and then they voted, or then they figured out why. There were 10 articles of impeachment. The first one is violation of the Tenure of Office Act. All the rest of them basically add up to we don't like him and we disagree with him and he said mean things about us. So there has been an impeachment, which means there's going to be a trial in the Senate. And Johnson's defense in the Senate was actually pretty sharp because he didn't argue he hadn't fired Stanton. He obviously had. What he argued is he didn't violate the law because the Tenure of Office Act says that a cabinet officer confirmed in the administration of a president, appointed in a president's administration, can't be fired in that president's administration without the approval of the Senate. And what Johnson says is, I didn't appoint Stanton. Lincoln appointed Stanton. I inherited him. Therefore, I did not appoint him. Therefore, the law doesn't apply. I can fire him. He wasn't confirmed at my behest, and therefore I can fire him. This is very clever, but it's not really what saves Johnson. What saves Johnson is the fact that everybody knows he's not going to be nominated by the Republican or the Democratic Party in the election of 1868. Here we are. It's well into 1867. Are you really on what everybody recognizes blatantly political terms? Are you really going to throw the president out of office to get rid of him 10 months early? He's going to be gone. You're going to get rid of him 10 months early. And of course, there was no provision to replace a vice president who had stepped up to be president in the 19th century. We don't get that until after World War II with the 22nd Amendment. And that means that the vice presidency is vacant. If you remove Andrew Johnson from office, it's the Speaker of the House who becomes the president. And the Speaker of the House was a radical Republican who was not very popular, even with radical Republicans, and nobody really wanted to see him be president, and particularly because if you have an incumbent Republican president, it's very awkward not to nominate him to be your standard bearer in 1868, and nobody wants to do that, not only because of the person involved, but because the Republicans know who they want to be the president in 1868, and that's Ulysses S. Grant. The great Union war hero. Grant's a shoo-in. He would win easily. If you have a Republican in the White House, then that gunks the works up for Grant. So eventually the Republicans decided that getting rid of Johnson early wasn't enough, and therefore he was acquitted by a margin of 1 vote. 1 vote and a promise to be on his good behavior for the remainder of his term. Johnson sort of kept that promise, except in this regard. He had heretofore always been willing to use his pardoning power. Anytime an individual Southerner pleaded with him for an individual pardon, Johnson was willing to do it. He liked to have these people grovel a little bit, but he was always willing to issue the pardon. Now, in the wake of his impeachment and acquittal, Johnson starts to give blanket pardons. If you served in the Confederate Army, you're pardoned. If you served in the Confederate Navy, you're pardoned. If you worked in the Confederate Congress, you're pardoned. He pardoned so many people that by the time that he leaves office in March of 1869, there are only 2 former Confederates who haven't been pardoned. One of them is Robert E. Lee, who asked for a pardon. But that pardon came in to Edwin Stanton when he was still Secretary of War. Stanton knew that Lee was the best of the Confederate generals and was such an exemplary figure, a Christian gentleman who was being held up as the symbol of the Confederate cause. That just drove Stanton crazy, that this knight-like figure had become the face of the rebellion. And so Stanton took Lee's request for a pardon, stuck it in a book, put it on a shelf. It wasn't discovered for many, many, many decades later. So Lee wasn't pardoned at the time. He will eventually be pardoned by President Gerald Ford in the 1970s. The other Confederate who didn't ask for and didn't get a pardon was Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, the only Confederate who was held in prison after the war. He was confined for 2 years, but he was released on bail, and he was never tried for anything because the government understood that you don't want to put Jeff Davis, who was a brilliant political orator, on trial, because then he will be able to argue, and probably successfully, that secession wasn't rebellion, secession certainly wasn't treason, so that secession was constitutional. Why run the risk? The war put an end to this. And so Jeff Davis was simply let go, and he never asked for a pardon. He will eventually get one from President Jimmy Carter, who is elected in the late 1970s, the first president from the Deep South. Carter was from Georgia, to reach the White House since the Civil War. That's when Jeff Davis got his pardon. So Johnson sort of got his revenge on the radical Republicans as he left office. But here's one of the interesting things. So much energy went into this political fight between Johnson and the Congress over what Reconstruction would look like, who was going to be in charge of it, that it used up a lot of valuable effort and valuable resources, and more importantly, valuable time. The North was going on. We were starting to build a transcontinental railroad. In 1867, we purchased Alaska from the Russians, and we annexed the Midway Islands in the Pacific, and Americans were turning increasingly toward westward expansion, industrialization, and urbanization. There were other issues to deal with, and people were putting their focus on those things. And so there was a window of opportunity here, in a way, that was lost for those who wanted to make Reconstruction truly radical. And in a way, Andrew Johnson had absorbed all of that energy, all of that desire to do something to punish rebels, to remake the South. He'd absorbed it onto himself, and therefore kind of acted as a shield, if you will, for the South against some of the more revolutionary impulses of the radical Republicans. And so we come to the end of Andrew Johnson's administration. And that means that I'm going to ask you a question. Just one question. This is the first question, and you have to email me the answer to get credit for this final lecture. There will be other questions as well. And that question is, what was the name given to Lincoln's Reconstruction plan? Lincoln had a plan, and when a certain number of people did a certain thing, a state could re-enter the Union. And so the name given to that plan was what? What was the name given to Lincoln's Reconstruction plan? So, Ulysses S. Grant is now the President of the United States. Grant comes in 1868. His campaign slogan is "Let us have peace." Remember, Grant had been dedicated to letting the Confederates down easily. He really wanted to put the country back together. Grant is going to serve two terms as president. That it speaks to the popularity of Grant as a military hero and Americans' predilection to elect military heroes to the presidency. Grant is going to be the president who's going to have to oversee this Reconstruction plan that had been put together in 1867 by the Congress that imposed military rule, military occupation on the defeated Confederacy. Now, it's easy to go overboard on an idea what that felt like. There were only 20,000 U.S. troops in the entire South during Reconstruction, and there's a vast amount of territory, so the troops are spread over a very large area. For example, in Texas, in the vastness of Texas, there were only 300 U.S. troops dedicated to Reconstruction. They were divided between Jefferson on the border and Austin and San Antonio. There were, of course, other U.S. troops out on the frontier fighting Indians, but in terms of enforcing Reconstruction, there's not very much. Grant's two terms are going to be known primarily for ineptitude and for corruption. Which is going to make corruption a big issue in forthgoing elections. But it was under Grant's term that this business of enrolling freedmen and giving them the right to vote began. You could also, of course, enroll whites who had not been disenfranchised by the 14th Amendment. But one of the interesting things that happens here is that a lot of white Southerners refuse to participate. They consider participation to be collaboration with the Yankees, with an occupation government, and that opens the door for Republican governments to be established in the seceded states, or the former seceded states. And there were three classes of people who made those governments possible. One of them was the freedmen, the former slaves. They were certainly a large number of the voters who are going to put Republican governments into office, but they're not going to make up a large percentage of the people who are elected to office. They obviously had the least clout because they were poor, they lacked education, the white racism. There will only be 14 black congressmen sent to Washington, D.C. During Reconstruction, and 6 of those are going to come from South Carolina. There are only going to be 2 black Republican senators, and both of those are going to come from Mississippi. And those 2 states are unique in that they had black majorities. And in no state legislature, although there would be far more black state legislators, in no former Confederate state would blacks make up a majority of the legislative body. And so you have the reality that the freedmen are important political muscle, but they don't get a lot of political power. And in fact, most of the blacks who were elected had not been slaves. They were literally not freedmen. They had been free blacks. They had been clergymen or things like that, artisans before the war. Then the other class of Republicans, or collaborationists, if you will, in the South are known as scalawags. These are white Southerners, white native Southerners, willing to work with Republicans or willing to become Republicans. A lot of them are former Whigs who, of course, had never really liked the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party was very much seen as the party of secession and rebellion. They tended to be urban whites who had not been planters, had not been slaveholders, and then poor whites from the mountains who had never owned slaves and did not like the planter aristocracy. This is the scalawag class, and of course, those 2 groups have nothing in common. The well-to-do urban Whig whites and the poor upcountry non-slaveholding whites really were kind of antagonistic to each other, and so they don't really get much in the way of power in these Republican state governments. The people who do are the carpetbaggers. The carpetbaggers, and so called because these are people who move to the South carrying their belongings in a suitcase that was made out of old carpet, literally a carpet bag. And the carpetbaggers were the people who had all the energy and the zeal, really. They were idealistic. They were people who wanted to improve the lot of the freedmen, who wanted to remake the South. Teachers, clergymen, Freedmen's Bureau workers, former soldiers who had come south and found that they liked the South during the war and wanted to stay there. There were people who came purely for opportunity. You're going to be rebuilding governments and rebuilding societies and rebuilding economies. It's a great place to get on the ground floor and make the most of it. Their motives ran in every direction, but the carpetbaggers dominated these state governments more than any other segment of the Republican Party. 9 governors out of 10 seceded states under occupation, for example, were carpetbaggers, and most of them former Army officers. There were 62 carpetbaggers elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and 17 to the U.S. Senate. Almost all of them former soldiers or doctors, teachers, lawyers, well-educated, certainly a very different class than the scalawags and the freedmen. So these are the people who are running things. They did not necessarily run things very well. There was a fair amount of corruption, but then that was true in the North as well. The war had unleashed enormous amounts of money into the economy. Contracts had been let very quickly. People had made fortunes overnight. Wheeling and dealing had been done and was still being done. The country was beginning to industrialize, and it was a brand new kind of an economy on a massive scale. There weren't rules, there weren't regulations, and so you had corruption everywhere in the South as well in the North. But over time, this is unsustainable because the majority of people in the South were Democrats, and they've all been pardoned. They're all capable of holding office again. They're all capable of voting, but they're refusing to do so. They consider that to be collaboration, but sooner or later they're going to get tired of that, and they're going to step up, and they're going to begin to participate again. And when they do, they are going to undo all of the work that the Republican controlled governments are going to accomplish. There are one really big event. This is a very controversial, very complicated period here, but the Republican Party is going to split over this question of, do we keep pushing Reconstruction or do we let it go? A lot of Northerners are going to get tired of it, tired of the effort, tired of the controversy. They're interested in other things. They had given the blacks citizenship, they had given the blacks freedom, they had given the blacks the right to vote, and most Northerners now expect the freedmen to, as it were, lift themselves up by their own bootstraps and make their way in the world to good. After all, this is what we expect immigrants to do. Of course, former slaves in a racist society are not going to be as capable of doing that as people who have managed to get their way across an ocean. The expectations were too high, and the racism was too deep, so that when the expectations were not met, people in the North didn't say, well, why weren't they met? What are the inhibiting factors? What are the circumstances? A lot of times, Northerners said, well, they're not met. Well, of course they're not met. Look at who we're talking about. Remember, North and South are equally racist in terms of today's standards. What the North was not necessarily willing to do was to see the GOP go away. The Republican Party became the party of modernization. It became the party of westward expansion and these sorts of things. But the Republicans figured out that they don't need the electoral votes or the popular votes of the former defeated Confederate states to stay in power. They've basically gotten a hold of the Midwest and the Northwest and the West and most of the East. And so that weakens the desire of Northerners to basically stay the course. The thing that Northerners are going to do is they're going to lose interest in fighting for civil rights. They're happy to let the South go back to running its own show. And little by little, Southern Democrats begin to participate again, then they begin to participate very vigorously, and as they do, they seize control of the state governments. They seize control of the state governments, and at that point, when the Democrats get control of those states, they are said to be redeemed. When Democrats get control of a former seceded state, they are redeemed, and you get Southern home rule again. And of course, that means that the freedmen are going to be shoved to the side. The carpetbaggers are going to lose power. The scalawags are going to be shoved off to the margins. And the Democratic Party is going to reassert itself to the extent that in 1874, 9 years after the end of the Civil War, the Democrats got control of the House of Representatives again. For the first time since the 1850s. And so we're beginning to move back to the balance, a Northern-controlled Senate, a Southern Democratic-controlled House. What the North was not willing to do, though, was to see evidence of Southern militarism, if you will. And so you wanted, as Southern Democrats, you wanted to redeem your state. You wanted to run the Republicans out. And the people who were providing the votes that let Republicans hold on were the freedmen. And so at first, you had Southerners trying to convince the freedmen to vote Democratic, and of course that wasn't going to work, and so you got to intimidation. And here's where the Ku Klux Klan comes into the story. The Klan was created in 1866 as a fraternal organization for Confederate veterans. So it was just a veterans organization, and this is an era in which Americans liked, societies and organizations that had funky costumes and strange titles and secret handshakes and this kind of stuff. But the Klan very quickly morphed from being a veterans organization to being a resistance movement movement, against Union occupation, and against Republican rule. And this is where the cross burnings and the midnight rides and the white costumes and the white hoods that made you look like a ghost all come in. If you couldn't force the freedmen to vote Democratic, then you could intimidate them, you could scare them, you could kill or lynch enough of them to convince them to stay away from the polls completely. You could do the same things to carpetbaggers and scalawags, a reign of terror, if you will, to keep these people from doing things that Southern Democrats did not want them to do. Grant dealt with this very decisively. The Congress gave him the authority to use force, and Grant basically told the South, if you do not cease and desist, if you continue to let the Klan do these things, I'm not going to withdraw Union troops as the Klan wants me to do. I'm going to send more of them in. I'm going to give you more of what you're fighting against if you do not back off. And that worked. It worked remarkably well and remarkably quickly, and the Klan sort of goes out of existence. And so Grant gets credit for acting decisively here, but basically the Grant administration, which has lots of other problems, fighting Indians out west, it's got corruption problems, none of that's enough to keep Grant from getting elected to a second term in 1872. Both times he gets elected by overwhelming margins. Grant is basically letting things take their course, and one by one these southern state governments are redeemed, and ultimately that brings us to the election of 1876. But before we get to the election of 1876, a second question for you, a second question that you must answer and email back as proof to me that you've been listening to this lecture. When a southern state that had seceded from the Union falls back under the control of the Democratic Party, when a southern state that had seceded from the Union falls back under the control of the Democratic Party, it is said to have been what? What's the term used to refer to a southern state that had left the Union that falls back under the control of the Democratic Party during Reconstruction? So the election of 1876, and that brings us very close to the end of our story. The election of 1876. By this point, all but 3 former Confederate states have been redeemed. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment are in the Constitution. The North's willingness to continue to push the issues of Reconstruction has pretty much waned. Grant would have liked a third term, but his second administration had become so notorious for corruption that he had to politely be taken off to the side and said, no, it's not going to happen. We're going to stick with the precedent established by Washington and adhered to by every chief executive since. So Lincoln is going to step off, or rather Grant is going to step off the stage. And 1876 is the centennial of the United States, the country's 100th birthday. In many ways, the country's not really into this election. Kind of gotten used to the Republicans being in power. You've had nothing but Republican presidents since 1860. There had been a depression in 1873 for which Grant got the blame. In other words, the country's got other things on its mind. And the North is more than willing to let the South run its own show as it sees fit. So you've gotten to a point where the North is distracted and not necessarily paying a lot of attention, willing to live and let live with the South. It has, because of the corruption in the Grant administration, Grant himself was not corrupt. Grant himself was scrupulously honest, but he was a very bad judge of political friends. He was as poor a judge of his political friends and allies as he had been a good judge of military officers during the Civil War, and that got Grant and his administration in trouble and besmirched his terms in office as corrupt. So the Republicans sort of lost the confidence of the country. The Southern Democrats are all participating again, and the Southerners have gotten control, Democrats rather, have gotten control of the U.S. House of Representatives thanks to Southerners coming back into the government. There was a real sense here that the Democrats could manage to win the presidency. So in 1876, the Republicans put forward a former Union general by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who had been a fairly good Union general during the Civil War. The Democrats put together a fellow named Samuel J. Tilden, who was from New York and had been a pro-war Democrat. So they both had acceptable wartime credentials. They were both promised to combat corruption. And so there really wasn't a lot to pick between them. When the election was held, it was a very tight contest. The election was a very, very tight contest. And as a consequence of that election, you had Tilden win the popular vote and 184 electoral votes. Hayes won 166 electoral votes, and basically believed that he had lost the election and was all but willing to concede that, except for the fact that it took 185 electoral votes to become president. To get to 50% plus one, you had to have 185 electoral votes, and Tilden, although he'd won the popular vote, remember that's not really matters, and he'd come up one shy in the electoral vote. So that should argue that the election be tossed into the House of Representatives, except for this. There were 19 disputed electoral votes. 19 disputed electoral votes. They came from three southern states that had yet to be redeemed. The only three left that had not yet been redeemed, South Carolina and Florida and Louisiana, and the Republicans still controlled those votes, and the Republicans counted the votes there, and they said, oh, according to our count, Hayes gets those 19 electoral votes, and that puts him into the presidency by a margin of one vote. So he's going to get the 185, and Tilden's going to be left at the 184. Everybody knew in those three states that the white Southerners had gone to the polls in overwhelming numbers, that Tilden unquestionably won the popular vote in those states, and therefore he should be getting their electoral votes. But the Republicans were the people doing the counting. And as the people doing the counting, they made the count work out the way that they wanted. In fact, both sides sent operatives into these states with literally satchels full of cash to do whatever was necessary, to do the bribing, the palm greasing, whatever. It's just the Republicans did it faster and did it more effectively than the Southerners. And so by the dint of those 19 disputed votes, Hayes was supposed to be president, and there it was. But here's the problem. The public does not elect the president. The Electoral College elects the president. Every state gets a number of electors equal to its 2 senators plus however many congressmen it gets. Whoever gets 50% plus 1 of the Electoral College becomes the president. But the vote of the Electoral College must be counted, according to the Constitution, the vote of the Electoral College must be counted before a joint session of Congress. To get a joint session of Congress, both the House and the Senate have to pass a resolution agreeing to meet together at a certain day in a certain place at a certain time. And this was always perfunctory, and it had always been done, no big deal. But with the Republicans controlling the Senate and the South controlling the House, Republicans said, yes, we'll have a joint session, and Southerners said, no, we won't. And because Southerners said, no, we don't, there weren't enough votes in the House to agree to a joint session. Well, no joint session, no counting electoral vote, no counting electoral vote, no electing the president. Well, this is something the Founding Fathers had never seen before. This is a big deal, and it made people very angry. There was talk about, what happens if both Tilden and Hayes show up and try and take the oath of office on the same day. Some people said that this could start a new civil war. It was, of course, a terribly frightening prospect, something nobody wanted to do. So you got to find a way out of this. And what Republicans and Democrats decided to do in January of 1877 to resolve the issue was to create a special commission and a one-time electoral commission whose job would be to investigate the circumstances of these disputed electoral votes and decide who's going to get them. And the agreement was that both parties would accept the findings of the commission unless both decided to reject it, which of course won't happen because one party will be happy with what this commission decides. The commission has to have members. There will be 15 members. There will be members from the Senate and from the House. Since 5 members from the Senate, 5 members from the House, and since the Republicans control the Senate, we will have 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats from the Senate on the Electoral Commission. Since the Democrats control the House, we'll have 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans from the House. So we'll have 5 members from the House, 2 Republicans, 3 Democrats. And then we will have 5 members from the Supreme Court. Who controls the Supreme Court? Well, Supreme Court justices are nominated by presidents, confirmed by the Senate, and they sit for life, and they tend to live a very long time. So you had Republican appointees, you had Democratic appointees, and therefore your 5 members from the Senate, what do you get? 5 members from the Supreme Court, what do you get? You get 2 Republicans, you get 2 Democrats, and then you get an anomaly for 19th century politics. You get 1 independent. That independent was David Davis of Illinois. He had been Abraham Lincoln's campaign manager, who was not a radical Republican by any stretch of the imagination. And so an investigation was held, and the vote was counted in the Electoral Commission, and lo and behold, what you had was 7 Republicans vote that Hayes should get those electoral votes, 7 Democrats that Tilden should get those votes, and that meant that this whole process was a way to let David Davis of Illinois decide who the next president of the United States was going to be. And he did not want that pressure. Would you want that pressure? I mean, come on, the whole country's seething with rage. Everybody's on pins and needles. There's talk about the outbreak of civil war, depending on which way this goes. Davis couldn't make up his mind, wouldn't make up his mind. Every day, the inauguration is getting closer and closer, and finally he's told, you have to decide. You can't let this drag out. Now, it's February. There's got to be an inauguration in the first week of March. David Davis never decided because the Illinois state legislature elected him to the U.S. Senate. You can't serve in the Senate and be on the Supreme Court at the same time, so Davis gleefully resigned from the Supreme Court to take up the Senate seat. If he's not on the Supreme Court, he can't be on the Electoral Commission, so we have to get another Supreme Court justices, and all the rest of the Supreme Court justices were Republican. And lo and behold, by a margin of 8-7, the Electoral Commission said Hayes gets those disputed electoral votes. And at that point, although the Democrats and Republicans said we're both going to abide by the decision unless we both reject it, Republicans, of course, weren't going to reject it. They liked the decision. The Democrats, especially Southern Democrats in the House, said, wait just a moment. That's foul play. We just saw what happened. No, we're not going to accept that. Still no joint session. Still no joint session. So here we are at the 1st of March. The inauguration is March 4th. And we don't know who the president's going to be. And the threat of the country coming apart again now seems very real, and a lot of people are very terrified. And at that moment, the Republicans did the thing that they were probably going to have to do all along. And on March 1st, Republican leaders went to the Southern Democrats in the House and asked the critical question, what's it going to cost us? What's it going to cost us? What do you want? And Southern Democrats in the House expected that question, and they were ready to answer it. Number 1, Hayes agrees to serve a single term. 1 term, he's out. Number 2, he must appoint a postmaster general who is a Democrat. Why does that matter? Because we still have the patronage system. New guy gets elected, he fires everybody, works for the government, replaces them with people who were from his party or helped him get elected. A postmaster general has more jobs to hand out than anybody because there's a postmaster in every little town and village and multiple postmasters in every city. And obviously, if you have a postmaster general who is a Democrat, he's going to hand those jobs to Democrats. Number 3, the Union Army of Occupation goes home. Northern occupying soldiers leave the South. We get an end to a military presence in the former seceded states. And then number 4, Congress must appropriate money to repair physical damage done to the South by the war, to clear harbors and ports and rebuild bridges and railroads and these sorts of things. So those were the terms of the Southern Democrats. And the Republicans said, you got a deal. You got a deal. And so on March the 2nd, you got the agreement for a joint session, and therefore there was the count of the electoral vote. Hayes was given the 19 disputed ballots. He won the Electoral College by a margin of 1 vote, and on March 4th he was inaugurated to the presidency of the United States. And most historians refer to this as the last great compromise between North and South, the last deal to, in essence, preserve the union between North and South. It's an interesting thing that the Southerners did, because obviously if Tilden had been elected to the presidency, and he probably rightfully should have been president. He won the popular vote. There's little question that those 19 disputed votes should have been his. He should have been president, not Hayes, but he was sacrificed. Why? As president, Tilden would have certainly withdrawn the Union Army of Occupation. Hayes would have never served a single year, let alone just 1 term, if Tilden had been president. Not just a postmaster general, but everybody in the government would have been a Democrat. So what is it that the Southern Democrats are getting with their deal to let Hayes be president that they wouldn't get with Tilden? The answer is the money. Because the Democratic Party did not believe in appropriating money for economic purposes, but the Republican Party did. And so it was the money to rebuild the railroads and the bridges and to clear the harbors and the ports and that sort of stuff. That's the thing that made the difference. For that, Southern Democrats were willing to sell the Northern Democratic candidate Samuel J. Tilden down the river, and so Hayes becomes president. He keeps his promise. He serves only a single term. And the Union troops go home. The money flows. And the last great compromise between North and South comes to an end. Reconstruction had, in fact, lasted just 11 years. And you go back to the South running its own show the way that it wants, North and South, living in harmony together. The political battles between Republicans and Democrats over policies and budgets and that sort of stuff, continues, but politics as normal in many ways. And the people who had sort of lost the most in this process were the freedmen, who were now forgotten about by most Northerners, disregarded. They had no economic clout. They had no political clout, and they would go deep into the 20th century, living in an environment where they were segregated, where the rights that they nominally had been given in the 14th and the 15th Amendment were not taken away from them, but they were denied the exercise of those rights, and the North was willing to go along with whatever the South wanted to do in that regard. So the legacy of the Civil War is going to continue, but the threat of the Civil War breaking out again, of course, is now behind us. And the last great compromise between North and South, the election of 1876, has been put into place, and it will hold together. So that brings me to my third and final question. What is the number of disputed electoral votes in the election of 1876? What is the number of disputed electoral votes in the election of 1876? So 3 questions, send me those 3 answers. Once you've done that, you will have finished all of your requirements for this course over the course of this very strange semester. So just a couple of things in closing. First off, thank all of you for your hard work and your effort. This online portion of the class is not something that you signed up for. It's certainly not something that I had bargained for. It threw us all into different paradigm, different requirements, different habits, sort of feeling our way forward. That was certainly the case with me. I was kind of crafting this as we went along, and so my apologies for any part of it that was confusing or awkward. If you have stuck with us and you've done all the work, and you get this last bit of questions and your last essay in on time, everybody is going to get the credit for the effort that I talked about at the beginning of the semester. Remember, effort is the thing that takes a borderline grade, takes a 79 and makes it a B, or takes an 89 and makes it an A. Certainly, effort is to your benefit, and you have earned it. And lastly, I hope that if nothing else over the course of the semester, you have come to realize that our history is a bond that belongs to all of us, regardless of our age, our race, our ethnic background, when our families came to this country, our political, our economic, or religious persuasions. American history is something that unites all of us. What has happened to all Americans is our common heritage, and that history is not irrelevant, it's not boring, it's not dry, it is in fact incredibly pertinent, it is incredibly exciting, and it is incredibly interesting. It makes the world in which we live. We make more history every minute of every day. This pandemic that we're living through, after all, is history, isn't it? Something that's going to be talked about in history books that your children are going to read, classes that they are going to take. And therefore, I hope that you have learned that history is not dry and it's not boring, that in fact is intriguing, it's exciting, it's fascinating, and I hope that you will continue to pursue it by watching documentaries or reading books or looking at websites, visiting historic sites, that kind of thing. When you engage history, it has so much to teach you. It has so many ways to enlighten you, to entertain you, to make you a more thoughtful and more dedicated citizen, and I think that's one of the real lessons that I want everybody to take away from the course. And I think that you'll find that history is a lot more fun when you engage it on your terms, at your schedule, instead of having to do so on the schedule of a class over the span of a single semester with tests and papers and all that kind of stuff, and taking some of the fun away from it. So again, thank you for hanging with it. I hope that you have found it enlightening, interesting, hopefully even a little bit enjoyable. I wish all of you the very best of luck going forward. And for some of you, maybe I'll see you in class for a History 2 session at some point. So stay well and good luck in your future endeavors.